Well, howdy, everybody. How you doing today? Hopefully things are going well. I have to check my audio. Seems to be functioning properly, I think. I think it's working correctly. Everybody let me know if I had to change a bunch of stuff. So we shall see if it's working or if it's not working and whatnot. I do recognize that this channel is typically fish-related, as the title hopefully denotes this. And then down here, this is the book club. This is the book club. This is the book club. So, those of you that actually ordered the book, look at this. I'll put it right where the overlay is. Bum, 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 bum. Those of you that ordered the book and actually read the book, I'd love to hear from you, hear from your take on it, if you have a minute to type it out. Didn't have anybody to actually bring on to talk during the book club here. I didn't recruit that hard to actually find anybody to come on for the book club. This is my first attempt at actively doing the book club. So this will be probably the first edition, and we shall see how it goes. I do believe that I will be relocating the book club likely to a different platform like Twitch. I know that a lot of people out there are like, I don't know what that is. Those of you that don't know what it is, it's just a different platform that you're able to live stream onto. It's a little more conducive to having like back and forth conversations with a lot of people, so we could have different people come in and out to give their takes on things that are going on. And plus, this is obviously a pretty contentious book for a lot of people. Like, one of the first things that I wanted to talk about was it. As an American, I try to see things through the scope of other Americans' experience while they're here, while they may or may not be reading something like this book. And even further into the book, I think we'll kind of jump to a later part in the epilogue here. It actually talks about Chief Justice John Roberts wrote that if residential segregation is a product not of the state action but of private choices, it does not have constitutional implications, which that statement would be true if the truth wasn't rooted in governmental action, which this book really highlights the fact that in the year 2020, oftentimes the perception that I personally have heard, and not necessarily putting words into anyone else's mouth, but I have heard from a lot of people that they believe that segregated neighborhoods and stuff like that is just a natural affect, right? That as if there's, Latino neighborhoods or Asian neighborhoods or black neighborhoods or white neighborhoods or something like that. Like, it's supposed to be some kind of like natural thing that happens, which does not even, I think, like, on a surface level, I think it's probably pretty easy for people to think like, oh yeah, okay, that's normal, right? I guess. But the reality is that most of this has been constructed over the last easily 140 years, I think, altogether, which sounds like this amazing amount of time when you say, like, oh, it's like it's been 140 years. But it's essentially a blink of an eye when you're talking to somebody who's 80 years old, who was directly affected by this, whose kids are 50 years old, who was directly affected by this, whose kids are, getting ready to have kids themselves, right? So, when you look at the generational type stuff that is going on, especially highlighted in a book like this that is so, one of the biggest things that stood out to me initially was the notes that are in here. Let me see how many. A good portion of this book is dedicated. So this much of this paperback book, this whole part right here, is actually the notes, source citations. I personally only looked up a handful of them, which I do intend to look up more of them. But the citations are in here as far as the notes go, and then there actually is a bibliography in it, which is just seems so rare to find a book these days that actually has a bibliography that's actually giving you, like, it's giving you where this interpretation of history happened. And, I'm sure that there's a lot of people out there that are like, oh, all the books I read have a bibliography in them. But personally, I don't see it very often these days. In this day and age, they just assume that you'll be able to look it up and whatnot. So this book essentially starts out at the very beginning and basically gives you a layout at the beginning. Let's start out here in section 1, where it actually gives you sort of the anecdotal inspiration that Richard Rothstein took to decide to make this book and to decide to author this book in such a very, very specific way. Like, there's not a whole lot of aggrandizing in here. There's not a whole lot of, like, here's an assumption that I make. Here's kind of what happens historically from point A to point B, which affected point C to point D, right? The very beginning is an anecdotal thing that is what inspired him, having met a guy in San Francisco whose name escapes me right now because I didn't write it down in my notes. Mr. Stevenson, that was his name, Frank Stevenson. So he met Frank Stevenson in 2013. He was a fairly elderly fellow at that point in time. He was born in 1924, so you think that's a guy that's when he met him, he was 89 years old. I don't know if he's still alive now, but you're talking about a guy who was born in 1924, who lived through the World War II, worked in the U.S., was African American through the whole time, through the civil rights, through post-civil rights, through the 2000s, all that stuff. And he basically met this guy and wanted to hear some of his, his story. So it actually goes through the whole progression of what this Frank Stevenson's life was all about. He grew up in the South, eventually moved to San Francisco to work during World War II, and how his life sort of progressed and the things that he was kind of affected with, which was not, I wouldn't say, I don't know, I would be hard pressed as a person to say that he specifically had a bad life, because it seems like he had opportunity to work. There was, he had definitely had some opportunity and thing, but it certainly wasn't without a lot of effort. As in, there's a point in the book where there's a lot of explanation into how public housing came to be. You think about the United States, we're a huge amount of land geographically, and housing is not, or was not, what it's like now. Now we have pretty much a surplus of buildings, although we do have a lot of buildings that need to be completely gutted and redone. Housing didn't really exist. So if you needed, for instance, in San Francisco, they needed an extra 80,000 workers to show up to San Francisco to work for the war effort in order to build boats and tanks and good Lord knows what else they all had to build. But it was a lot of manufacturing and stuff, and you needed a ton of people to do it. Well, people couldn't move there because there wasn't anywhere for them to live when they arrived, right? So public housing was what was instituted, and public housing was never instituted as what we see it today, that essentially, only people on Section 8 and stuff like that can live there, blah, blah, blah. That's not how it started. It started out as actual places for people to live, federally funded buildings and construction projects, and yet with the intention for it to last kind of forever. It was never really like this is only a temporary thing, except for when it applied to the black population. That was specifically designed and built crappily and in crappy areas, so that, the temporary workers that are going to come here for the war can then just go back to wherever they came from when the war is over, and we'll just bulldoze those buildings or whatever they were going to do. They were literally built down by the docks, down by the rail yards, all this in these terrible areas. And you start to kind of realize that, like, the beginning of what was a huge boon for a lot of families in the United States, and that would be all World War II, was kicked off like in just purely indoctrinated in segregated practices in order to, it's just really like nothing else to really put to it other than it was just pure racism. And it was federally funded that way. It was federally funded to be enacted upon whatever race you were. And what ended up happening is a lot of the white people moved out of the federal housing, right? And how did they move out? Well, they moved out because there were a ton of zoning practices and federally backed loans for developers to build segregated housing projects, and it's seen from coast to coast. It's not just San Francisco. It's seen in New York. It's seen in Louisiana. You've seen it in Texas, California, Washington, everywhere. You see that same kind of stuff everywhere. There's a good example right here. It's like carefully compiled zoning regulations are the most effective because they not only exercise control over the subject property, but also over the surrounding areas. However, they are seldom complete enough to assure homogeneous and harmonious neighborhood. So basically what they were doing was specifically engineering areas where only people of a certain race could live, and it was specifically being implemented not only by federal law, but also by state law, but also by private practice. And what has come to exist in the year 2020 is this myth that is essentially a myth that this was all done by private businesses, as in redlining, right? I have consistently heard about redlining. As a matter of fact, I heard about redlining like 3 days ago from somebody that I happen to know and was talking with, that they were like, oh yeah, that's that redlining thing, but we don't do that anymore. And our current president was sued by the Department of Justice for redlining in 1973, I believe. In 1973, our current president, or 71, it was either 1971 or 1973, our current president was sued by the Department of Justice because of the redlining practices that him and his father were doing. So it's like, for us to sit here and imagine that, oh, well, it was only private practice. Well, first of all, this book obviously highlights that to not be the case, because it was all formatted on and built upon by the federal government, by the federal programs that were put into place, and then extended later on once civil rights movement once the civil rights movement happened, while private businesses were implementing this stuff. And you start to get to a timeline where it's like, wait a minute, those people only stopped doing that 45 years ago? Crap, I know people that are 65 years old. I know people that are 75 years old. I know people that were directly affected by that. And this book also highlights just how different the final example of that is, considering when you take into effect the Great Depression, then to World War II, then through the Civil Rights Movement, then to the 80s, and then to the 2000s where we live now. Whereas the median white family income is now about $60,000 a year, while a median black family income is about $37,000, about 60% as much. You might expect the ratio of black to white household wealth would be similar, but median white household wealth, assets minus the liabilities, is about $134,000, while median black household wealth is about $11,000, less than 10% as much. Not all of the enormous difference is attributed to the government's racial housing policy, but a good portion certainly is. So essentially what this book kind of diagrams and shows you what the federal portion of the liability would be in regards to the United States and the people that live here now. In that, if everything had been equalized at some point in time, you would say, well, all the households are earning the same amount of money. And even if you were to say, okay, well, obviously it affected schooling and whatnot in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, those families weren't able to send their kids to college because they didn't own home. They didn't own a home to be able to take out a simple school loan, which is highlighted. Yeah, which is highlighted right here. So in the 20s, there was a big push to try and normalize the idea that people would own their own homes, and this is where a lot of the loans started coming out and whatnot to build those federal housing projects and stuff. So the federal government's policy of racial exclusion had roots earlier in the 20th century. The Wilson administration took the initial steps. Terrified by the 1917 Russian Revolution, government officials came to believe that communism could be defeated in the United States by getting as many white Americans as possible to become homeowners, and the idea being that those who owned property would be invested in the capitalist system. So in 1917, the Federal Department of Labor promoted an Own Your Own Home campaign, handing out We Own Our Own Home buttons to school children and distributing pamphlets saying that it was a patriotic duty to cease renting and build a single-family unit. The department printed more than 2 million posters to be hung in factories and other businesses and published newspaper advertisements throughout the country promoting single-family ownership, each one had an image of a white couple or family. So the Secretary of Commerce at the time was Herbert Hoover, who played an important role. There also was Friedrich Law Olmsted Jr. and James Ford, Vice President Calvin Coolidge, and the President of the American Construction Council, Franklin D. Roosevelt. So, it's kind of one of those things that, like, I think the reality is that some serious portions of the United States just being so deeply rooted in kind of avoiding the history of the United States, they're really, really, really avoiding and kind of sugarcoating and whitewashing over the history of the United States, in the fact that they try to act like everything is, if it's something that we're kind of responsible for, we'll just say that that's like private business practices. Those are private businesses that were doing that. That wasn't us. Whereas it's like, you have an established policy here which involves multiple presidents, right? We have multiple presidents involved in a policy that all, Calvin Coolidge clearly, if you look at like the public perception of Calvin Coolidge, one of the most ineffective presidents of all time, least popular presidents of all time. Okay, he was there. Franklin D. Roosevelt, that he became a president, he was there also, involved in this stuff. And, whether some of those guys made up for it later on in life or attempted to make amends for it later on in life, okay, I'm 100% understanding that someone could learn more later on in life and completely change and try and fix and repair things that happen. But it also doesn't change the fact that those guys knew and were involved, and then proceeded to use that powerful position to eventually either become the president or become the president. I mean, Calvin Coolidge and Franklin D. Roosevelt became the president. It's very interesting, and I do have to admit that I am a little bit conflicted at this point as I start to learn more about this kind of stuff, and then have to fact check it, and then continue to move on from there to sort of the acceptance phase, and then going, okay, well, how do I include this within my psyche? Because when you grow up in a society that's constantly saying the same thing, which may or may not be true, it eventually just kind of becomes a part of your doctrine. And regardless of who you are, that's just a human affectation. There's nothing different about me from other people that just go, well, that's that thing that I heard about a million times, and so I just say that it's that thing, right? And we're kind of at a point right now where we do have the technology, we do have the ability, to look and learn about and start to piece together and share some of this information around. I know that I'm fairly connected with the aquarium hobby. That's what mostly what my YouTube channel is about. I'm not the most versed historian in the world. I do know a bunch of, I did know some of this stuff ahead of time. But it does take somebody like Richard Rothstein to like put all this together and have something like a bibliography so that you're able to back it up and go, okay, what's behind this? So I specifically had a conversation with my mother recently. She wants me to watch this documentary, which I'm sure I will, and I have seen parts of it already, and I will watch it at some point in time. And one of my big issues of late in the year 2020 is not specifically with documentaries per se, but the format that they're presented in has allowed certain thought processes that have just become kind of indoctrinated in the United States that, all of our laws are just so perfectly built, oh, there's no racist law in the land. I literally I don't want to quote anybody on accident, but I did hear a conservative speaker recently saying that, like, well, none of our laws are racist at all. None of our law is racist. There's no racism in our law, so everything's fine. And there's always this projected ideal within the United States that, well, if you just work super hard, you'll get super successful. Which, even if you were just to look at even the statistic of the median household in the United States, is, so even let's say, even from those statistics of the median household, white versus black, right? So a black median family is making $37,000 a year. A white median family is making $60,000 a year. So that's the median income across the board for those two racial groups. We could find the numbers, I think, and I'll put that in my notes over here. So I want to find numbers for median households other than white and black families. I'm going to write that in there. Okay. So we do know that that's the median income, which there's a likelihood that somebody's making $40,000 a year. There's a likelihood that somebody's making $80,000 a year, but there essentially becomes zero likelihood that anybody's making $1 million a year or $5 million a year or $10 million a year. And I think that the normalization of those kinds of numbers within our conversations in regards to the livelihoods and whatever the American dream is, those are such a distortion as compared to what the average everyday day-to-day life that most of us are living. And my annual income is more like on the black family end, not the white family end, which is fine. It means all my bills are paid, and I'm not bad. I'm certainly not starving or anything like that. But the idea that if you just work super hard, eventually you're going to get rich. I mean, even if you're making $60,000 a year, it's going to, if you spent none of your money, it would take you 20 years to get to $1 million, right? 18 years. But, that's an impossible number for somebody to hit if you're at the median household. So how would you be able to accumulate a net wealth of, on average, 134,000? How would you accumulate that money as a family wealth, which is your assets minus liabilities, to get to 134,000? Even if you're making $60,000 a year, and your expenditures were, let's say, to keep the numbers simple, let's say your expenditures were 2/3. So you're making $60,000 a year, 2/3 of the money goes out the door for expenditures, taxes, all that stuff. And even if you were saving it, right, and somehow saving $20,000 a year, it would still take 7 years to get to that point where you would actually have accrued $134,000 worth of net worth for your family. Donald's Fish Vibe says, by owning assets with sensible mortgages, property value increases quickly. Yeah, and that's the thing. If your family previously, so the previous generations of your family, were excluded from being able to own a home and accrue an asset with a sensible mortgage, and the property value go up, and each additional generation from before was able to take out what would be considered a sensible loan for a higher education, you start to look at this kind of cascading avalanche effect of being able to pass on this wealth to the next generation kind of over and over again with not there really is no like more effort, right? It's that you can't really measure the amount of effort that is being put in or out by really anybody. But if somebody is working the same amount and making the same amount of money and their family assets are going up through the roof, you would have to find like some kind of common denominator to be able to evaluate why one group is doing so much better than the other group. And I've never seen any evaluation that one group is somehow better than the other, right? Like that just is nonsensical psychobabble whenever I hear that from people that like, well, maybe these people are just better at math. Like, what? Like doing math is a learned behavior. Like there is no math wizard that exists. I mean, it's pretty easy to explain that like, oh, well, Elon Musk, he's like a math wizard. I have regularly argued how not wizardy Elon Musk is. He was fairly good at programming computer websites when programming computer websites was a mystery, which, by the way, there really was only a couple of computer languages back then. He made an astounding amount of money selling a program that news companies would be able to plot a pin geographically on what story happened where. Which, as we all know nowadays in the year 2020, is just not an important piece of technology. They took that money and then created PayPal. PayPal sold, and he made $100 million. What is it, $80 million or something? But he was already in the positive a bunch of millions of dollars in the 90s, which is like, yeah. When they talk about the .com stuff, that's where that came from. But this book definitely highlights where racial lines met economic lines in a disparity that doesn't make any sense. To me personally, as a person, I can obviously intellectually understand what it was that people were doing. It is wildly wrong. I mean, it's just on a million, on every metric, it's wrong. Like there's no rightness to what these laws were about. The cover of the book here, you can see the red and yellow and green and white areas. What this map is, and you can find a much more illustrated part about it in the epilogue. As the New Deal Housing Agency, which the New Deal was a really important project for the United States. It's one of the biggest reasons we were able to get out of the Great Depression, to rebuild the country, to be able to continue moving forward as a country. I think most people would like to point at World War II. I like to point before that to the New Deal when housing was really being done and things were being aggressively done to improve the country. Whereas while they were doing that, you can see this map right here. Here's the blown out black and white version that is at the beginning of the epilogue here, which does denote the New Deal Housing Agency drew maps of metropolitan areas nationwide. Neighborhoods where African Americans resided were colored red to caution appraisers not to approve loans. This is a map of Detroit. That's what this map is of, right? So you have to think for a second, even just a second, that people would go, why is Detroit so super segregated in the year 2020? And I say you, that's the wrong way to put it, but the assessments were done in this extremely, extraordinarily racist way to not approve loans within a city like Detroit, which, hindsight being 2020, you don't really, we know that Detroit eventually became this huge manufacturing metropolis that eventually collapsed. And I would argue, not until I'm blue in the face or anything like that, but metropolises like Detroit collapsing is because the foundation of that country was built on just completely shoddy planning, on the fact that, like, you're not gonna approve loans to where black people were gonna live. I mean, that's, that's when we start to kind of look at, like, okay, how did we get where we're at right now? And me as a white guy, it would be like, if I didn't know a lot of this stuff, right, I could see how some white guy would go, well, what's this Black Lives Matter mean thing, right? What are you talking about? But once you start to couple the fact that once the segregated housing practices that were built in the United States and integrated segregation was formulated and spread throughout the whole United States in what homes were going to be built or not built, or where people could live or where people could not live. And then the civil rights movement happened, and then they took a turn to go, well, we can't do the housing thing anymore because now we were catching people and we got caught. What are we going to do? They just focused on policing, and putting people into prison. And I don't think there's anybody out there that could convince me by just arguing at me that the reason we have over 2 million people in prison is because there are just so many crimes. There's just so much crime going on. And I have seen an astounding amount of crime in my life, and I wouldn't say that the level of crime is so high that we should have 2 million people in prison. It just doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. I thought this book was wonderful. I haven't seen really any comments from people in the chat on whether or not anybody read it, but let's see. Joel, it's a lifetime of lifestyle decisions. I and a coworker worked for the same salary for 8 years. He went higher for 2 years. I took a home mortgage. He enjoyed himself. Today I have fully paid home. He still has no assets. See, the idea would be that, like, the ancillary examples of anecdotal evidence, right, is that, like, well, me and this other person, we were doing this, I was doing this, and he was doing that, right, is what I think personally confuses a lot of people, and I have fallen prey to that thought process myself. There have been times where I have worked at the exact same place. I made my specific decisions, somebody else made their specific decisions, and at whatever point in time, it is fairly easy to go, well, I've worked out so much better than this other guy. But as you stated, there's like an 8-year period that you're going for and making that assessment. And the unfortunate thing is like, you could make an 8-year assessment of what happened to you and what happened to them, right? And this person just chose to do this or that or the other thing. And the unfortunate part is like, that data doesn't necessarily apply to something like the United States as a population of 350 million people in a geography that is as big, if not bigger, than the European Union combined. When you just apply an anecdotal example of like this person versus that person, it doesn't it doesn't really work out where we could just go, oh, it's a lifestyle choice, because some people are making different lifestyle choices as to how they were raised and where they were raised and what happened their entire lives, right? One thing that we do know in the year 2020, and I'll have to look up this, have to find this study, and I didn't realize I was going to talk about it, but the decision-making process of the poor. I think we might be able to find it. Oh, here we go. Yeah. So this is a UK a study that was done in the UK, if it loads and I can find it here. The Department of Psychological and Behavioral Science. So attempts to reduce poverty need to recognize the powerful impact of the experience of low socioeconomic status on people's decision-making process, right? So I'll gladly share this link here. And you guys can go look it up, and maybe it's a jump off point for you to kind of look into something. So it's very easy for me as a person, as just an individual guy that goes and looks at somebody else and goes, that guy's just making bad decisions, like, psh, right? But when we start to look at the affect that somebody has grown and lived their entire life in a poverty type situation, what it does on their decision-making process throughout their entire life, right? That's when you start to see like, oh, wait a minute. So somebody who's experienced poverty and what has happened to them in their entire life is what is creating their ability to make a decision. And like a good example would be somebody that doesn't want to wear a mask at Walmart. Some white guy, 55 years old, at a Walmart in whatever city, someone tells him to wear a mask. He starts screaming no and yelling and acting violent, and they have to call the police on him, and then he attacks the police because these people are trying to put the whatever on me and blah, 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 and whatever crazy reasons. It would be super easy for me to go, 55-year-old white guy that wants to shop at Walmart, just put your stupid mask on, bro. But I don't know the history of that guy and what has created whatever decision-making process that has happened to him throughout those 55 years. Maybe he was super poor and whatever, right? Or what, it would be impossible for me to like know everybody's 55 years of experience throughout and what their decision-making process is. But that's what some of these studies are, like what people's decision-making has been involved by their socioeconomic standing in the world and what has happened. So here's a good example from this study right here, just one of the liner notes, which is, for many individuals living in poverty, the choices made are not always bad ones, but are adapted to the constraints of life with very few resources. Public engagement and education can challenge stereotypes about those living in poverty and reflect the functional nature of decision-making for those on low incomes, right? So somebody that has adapted to making decisions with never having a future ahead of them financially has a tendency to make, I don't really like the wording here, but make a like less informed decision or more emotional decision, or, I don't know. I don't know the wording there. This is me not being a psychobiologist, but essentially what it is, like people living in a super poor situation with no family, wealth and, wealth to back them up. Like maybe you don't have parents, but you have, my grandparents. The worst thing that could happen is I got to call my grandparents and see if they can help me out and pay my rent or something like that. Because no matter how many good decisions you made, at least you got backup. You know what I mean? But for a lot of this poverty type situation that continues and continues and continues, we find that like on the individual basis, from the individual standpoint, they end up making bad decisions because that's just how they make bad decisions. And also, somebody who goes from doing really well, like somebody who's really well established, you give them zero resources, because they can study people that have like gone from having money to having no money. There's enough humans around, you can find them. And what their decision-making process looks like, and what their decision-making process looks like under MRI. So they'll put you like in a MRI machine, have you make decisions and see which portions of your brain are lighting up to like actively make that decision. And it's that kind of stuff that we're starting, we have the availability to now. In the year 1999, when I would be arguing this kind of stuff, it was way more, it was exceedingly difficult to try and like track down this kind of information, to find studies that you could at least, find out, like, let me garner more information in regards to what's going on. But that's the reality of like, I never bought a home early, right? Because A, I wasn't making enough money. B, it was too difficult to save a down payment. But like somebody who just kind of forgets things that happened to you in the past, there was a point where in 2002, I was approved for a loan. I had found a property. I was going to buy it, but from the emotional standpoint, I didn't want to buy that property because I wasn't sure about the relationship that I was in at the time. That's 18 years ago now, maybe even 19 years or whatever. And so for me, I actually have to sit down and think like, what's actually even my own history? Like, let me put all this kind of stuff together. And one of the reasons that I do remember is that I went back before the housing crash, what was that, 2008, to see how much that property had appreciated, and that's kind of the deal. Donald's Fish Vibes, it's a good question. This is our first book club. So I announced this book for a couple of weeks. I posted links for it if people wanted to buy it, read it, get the audio book, any of that kind of stuff. And then this is kind of my first take on doing the book club. I'm doing it on YouTube. I think the one I'm going to do in the future is on Twitch. It doesn't cost anybody to watch. It doesn't cost any money for anybody to watch it on Twitch. Just the same as on YouTube. If you have internet access, you can just watch it. You may have to make an account or something like that. But Twitch has been around for many, many, many years now, so it's just as reputable as YouTube. It's just a different platform, but it will be a little bit. Kind of a different format moving forward, but I really just kind of wanted to try it out and see if we really had people interested. You have to see if whether or not people are actually interested in it, and whether or not they're would actively want to be involved. So I guess that's kind of part of the reason that I was more interested. Oh my God, the paper book went super down in price. So it's only $10 right now. Let me get the link. It's $10.77. So that's a pretty good deal considering the cover price is like $24 or something. I don't know. I don't know if that's true. Is the cover price true? Ginger says, not Twitch. Don't make me use Twitch. Well, the thing is, like, I mean, I could continue to do it on YouTube. I mean, we'll see how it goes. But one of the things about Twitch is it's more interactive. Like, in the way that, like, I could have people call in if they wanted to or not. And we could actually have we can have multiple people on. We won't get hammered if people drop an F-bomb or something. It's not like I'm getting, in trouble or whatever. It's just kind of like a more open format space for discussion type things. I mean, I know I do the live streams here, but I would say that like most of the people that follow my YouTube channel are like just fish people, and maybe they are interested in learning this kind of stuff, but there's just like kind of a clear example right now in comparison to the earlier stream I did today, which was just a basic stream, and we kind of just talked about fish and stuff. We had like, what, I think the top number was, on a day that I don't normally stream, we had like close to 60 people was the most concurrent. On this book club, we have 22. So, there's just a definite difference in what people are actively interested in and what they want to do. So that's like kind of the spot, is that going like, okay, we could just have the book club thing on Twitch and then not really have to make another YouTube channel. It'll be like, go to this other YouTube channel that blah, 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 blah. Whereas Twitch, we can just realistically kind of do what it is that we're doing. As Big D Smoke says, when you're dirt poor, you got to do what the WT farts you got to do just to make it to tomorrow a lot of the time. Yeah, and that's the thing, is that if we'd speculated about that in 1984 or 1995, we wouldn't have had the specific studies to kind of back that up. It would just be like anecdotal, which is kind of the problem. It's kind of the problem when we get into like too many conversations about just anecdotal evidence, right? It's kind of one of those things that we have to rely on these types of studies to go, okay, let me formulate a realistic opinion that isn't just 100% like what I like and what I don't like, right? Just on the basis of like, well, I don't like that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had some really bad aspects and did some really bad things in his life. It's like, but he did. No, like I said, he may have come around. He may have garnered more information. He may have changed his stance and gone, oh my God, I completely screwed up, blah, blah, blah. Let me try to make up with it. And did everything that he could to fix it, right? And I think that's a reality of just humanity, that like we all have to kind of, come to, we all have to kind of like come to our like recognition on whether or not whatever it is that somebody had done was either so bad that there's just no coming back from it. Like Jeffrey Dahmer, there's just no coming back for that guy. Or do people make misinformed decisions because that's how they were conditioned their entire lives and thought that they were making the right decisions, and eventually learned enough about the rest of the world that they decided, oh my God, I can't believe I was going down this road. And I think that we're all like, there's not a person that is innocent of that happening to them in life. I don't think that there's a person that is just, would you just come out of the womb and like already know everything? Like it doesn't exist. I mean, Einstein went to school, but also that dude was splitting atoms in, let me see here. When did Einstein split the atom? I don't want to say the wrong date. Split atom. What year? 1938. Yep, I was going to say 38. I should have just gone with it, but you got to look this stuff up. So, you got to think that, like, Einstein was splitting atoms in 1938. It's not like we didn't have we didn't know, like, these people were just dumb. But I think the reality is that, like, a lot of these people were really sort of just indoctrinated and conditioned in one direction. And some of them got over it because they learned and gathered more information about the world around them, or maybe they had a personal experience that kind of forced them to learn more. But, as you can see, like, Franklin Roosevelt was part of the construction, or he was the president of the Construction Association, whatever, of America. I can remember the name of it. It's not something that exists now. But he was on the board that was fully endorsing segregation in 1917. By 1938, he was already fully the president by then, right? So which is, to us now, we just say that in one sentence, but that's 20 years, difference of the timeline, right? Which, you start to do the math on that. It's like 365 days in a year times 20. And I can't do that math in my head right now. I'm going to get it wrong. So let's just look it up real quick. 7,300 days, which is a lot. And then you start to think about if you had 20 years and every single year you worked full time, which is currently 2,040 hours, right? With 2 weeks off. But I don't think you have 2 weeks off anymore. I think the pandemic has just led us to, we have to work forever, and we're just going to work until we're gone. But we'd also have to think, back then, they generally worked the 6 and 7 day work weeks, which the Americans had to riot in order to get people, and they burned people, they killed people, they stopped traffic, they did all that stuff. They shut down cities for weeks at a time in order to get the work week down so that people could have some days off. Otherwise, the corporations were just forcing them to work forever. But if we think in the rule of 10,000 hours, right? So the idea is that if you work on something whatever project for 10,000 hours, you want to learn the piano, you want to whatever it is, whatever thing it is you want to do, you become an expert after properly working at it for 10,000 hours. You think in 20 years, every 5 years, you could have learned some kind of expertise, that you could have learned some level of expertise, right? In that 20-year period, you could be looking at, like, Franklin Roosevelt maybe became an expert in a couple of things other than what he had already had his expertise at in 1917. In that 20-year period, he could have learned certainly a lot and decided, oh, wait a minute, this is a bad idea. Ninja Ghost says, Einstein was a genius from years ago. He was wrong a lot. That is right. He was wrong a lot, and he willingly admitted it, which is good. We need more of that. I've been wrong a million times in my life, that's for sure. But I was more just highlighting that, like, in that period of time, he warned Franklin Roosevelt that, like, this bomb is splitting the atom is an extremely bad idea. Ghost says, unless you're 100 years old, you learn from someone else what you know. I would imagine a 100-year-old person learned what they know from other people too. That's just simple humanity. Is that, like, we teach, not necessarily. Well, I guess we teach our own kids, we teach children, but we also teach people our own age and older and younger. And either way, like, we're all kind of teaching each other what we can, and hopefully, and bringing some benefit. And bringing some kind of benefit to the table. And that's ultimately, like, my, what was it? Somebody was saying bottom line a lot. We only know what we were taught, bottom line. Yeah. So it's like, that's my bottom line, is, like, how can we start to make a realistic assessment of what is going on in the United States if we can't even look realistically at the history of the United States and what built us to where we are now. And we just, how are we going to get there? Like, how are we going to get there if we don't even have an actual representation of our past? Which is why I'm appreciative of books like this. 100%. I really am. I don't even know if I did it justice to even do a synopsis on what is in here. There's so many important things that are documented in here. Obviously, it is a full-on book, and this is just me talking on the internet, which is kind of my point earlier about the documentaries that are out there. I was having a conversation with my mom about documentaries, and it's very easy for a documentary to just put a spin onto something. And my example was the Michael Moore documentary, and whether or not you like Michael Moore or not, it doesn't matter. This was my this was just my example. Was the Michael Moore? What was the newest one? Yeah, The Planet Full of Humans. Or Planet of Humans. Yeah, it's like a humanist thing or something. So it's 1 hour and 38 minutes. What is it? 1 hour and 39 minutes long, with the intro and the outro and the just whatever. But one of the weird things is like, so this documentary movie, right? It highlights like how we could change the Earth. What's going on with global warming or whatever, all that kind of stuff. And then it suddenly takes this crazy turn where they start going into like, we're overpopulated, which any of the reputable studies that I have seen have not shown that we are overpopulated. We do need to more effectively use our resources. We need to not pollute as much, all blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. Yes, we do produce enough for a much bigger population than we have now. And one of the biggest things is that education is the key to family planning so that we don't accidentally end up with too many people eventually, right? Like if we continue the population growth, we will eventually become overpopulated. But there's really, I have not seen a single study that says 7 or 8 billion people on the planet is overpopulated, realistically, from a reputable site. Now, there are some areas that people should likely move from, but what technology exists that could be implemented in those areas is really my question at this juncture. It's like, can we bring technology to those areas, or are we just going to suddenly go with the narrative that we just have too many people? There is at no point in time in my mind is there currently a real argument about overpopulation right now. Yet, if you watch that documentary, you would likely come out going, "Oh, well, we just have too many people." And my argument towards that has almost always been, well, who are you picking then? Who are you choosing? Their guy, because then that kind of puts you in there with those German fellas that were very excited about considering that they were overpopulated, and and that's ridiculous to me, and it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't matter what lens you put it through, unless it's like some hyper racist, crazy, weird, nonsensical lens that doesn't make any sense. But I think ultimately that's like one of the weird things that has existed in our country for a really long time. So part of this book does really isolate the hiring practices, even in World War II. that, and let me see here. I think I have it highlighted here. Yeah. So here you go. So noncompliance with the president's non-discrimination order did not affect companies' federal contracts, partly because the Roosevelt administration's enthusiasm for racial equality, while genuine, was lukewarm. More important was the president's conviction. More important was the president's conviction, hard to dispute, that every other objective had to be subordinated to winning the war. But even granting this premise, the unconstitutional treatment of African Americans called for remediation, if not during the war, then afterward. Yet the federal government's complicity in the suppression of African American labor rights and opportunities was never addressed, not then and not since. A government-backed dual labor market continued after the war's end. In 1944, the GI Bill was adopted to support returning servicemen. The VA not only denied African Americans mortgage subsidies to which they were entitled, but frequently restricted education and training to lower-level jobs for African Americans who were qualified to acquire greater skills. In some cases, local benefit administrators refused to process applications to four-year colleges for African Americans, directing them to vocational schools instead. Servicemen with dishonorable discharges were ineligible for benefits under the GI Bill, and African American soldiers disproportionately received dishonorable discharges, some for protesting segregation in Army towns. So could somebody explain that is a foundation of equality within the United States, right? So we had to go to war for World War II, right? The returning soldiers from World War II were granted a GI Bill to be able to buy a house that was, by the way, dirt cheap, right, in comparison to today's market. But you're granted a GI Bill to buy a house, to go to college, to do that stuff. So not only were you denied the GI Bill, but you're also denied the GI Bill because you didn't want to be a part of segregation. So you're like, no, I don't want to be segregated. Oh, cool. We're going to deny your GI. We're going to deny you any of your, I don't know, what's the word? I don't know, any of the GI Bill benefits. There we go. The benefits is what I'm looking for. But we're gonna deny you because you didn't want to be segregated. But the denial is a dishonorable discharge because you don't want to be segregated. You see how circular, crazy this logic was back then, but that's what was going on. In 1944, Jackie Robinson was arrested and tried in general court-martial when he was an Army lieutenant stationed at Fort Hood, Texas. His crime was refusing to move to the segregated section of a bus. Robinson, who 3 years later would be the first African-American to play Major League Baseball, was already nationally known as an athlete, and the Army might have feared arousing unrest in the African-American community if he were convicted. Also, during his trial, the Army finally prohibited segregation on buses that transported soldiers. Probably for both of these reasons, he was not convicted. Had Robinson been dishonorably discharged, the Brooklyn Dodgers would undoubtedly have refused to hire him, and the trajectory of civil rights in the 20th century would have been retarded at least. I don't know, it's a hard word to throw out there, but the civil rights... So, like, even in that instance that, like, you go to fight in World War II, you come home, and you have much less availability to get an education, to move forward. They promoted people of color to go to vocational school, like oh, you don't need to go to higher learning. That's not good for you. You know, and from my own standpoint, like, my grandfather was in World War II. He was a captain. And he was a bombardier, so he was a flight captain who flew I don't want to get the numbers wrong, but I believe he flew on over 70 missions, blah, 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 whatever. I will tell you, as a personal standpoint and a personal note onto who my grandfather was, the military was quite formative to his later years in life, sort of, if that makes sense. I didn't know him when he was much younger, but I did know him when he was much older, and he did give me advice on a few occasions that did influence my decision-making process to not join the military, because he believed that the advantages did not outweigh the disadvantages to having been in the military. And it did affect me from most of my most everybody in my family being in the military, to having made a decision in regards to, my father was in Vietnam War, my uncles were in the wars, they were enlisted, all that stuff. And most of them, I had a conversation with them when I was a young man about whether or not I should join up. And it really did influence my decision-making process. But somebody that really had no outs during World War II, you join up, you go do your duty, you come home, and you just get treated like garbage, realistically. And it's not even a matter of like, oh, we're just treating all the soldiers like garbage. No, we're just treating these ones, and we're giving these ones all this stuff. And that kind of, and this sort of stuff just, so Dennis says, today they hide it and use racist laws and legislation. I'm not going to argue against that statement, but I am going to say it is far lesser than it was. It is currently lesser. Does that mean that it's fixed? No, far from it. No one could convince me that like, oh, it's fine. The laws are totally fine. It is getting better, but I do believe that on a personal standpoint, it's literally only going to get better if people are exposed to our actual past and not some completely confounded, twisted idea that everything has always been equal in the United States. It has not even remotely. And if I hear from one more person that tells me, well, the slavery was a long time ago, great. That's what do you think it, what here, read the book. Here's just the law around housing to understand the asset wealth that on average white families bring to the table versus black in the United States, and why that came to be. Just the amount of assets that are being carried by the typical white family through the actions that are basically exactly the same historically, I mean, my family had a much stronger position from my father's side of my family because my grandfather was in the military. He fought in the war. He didn't die, and he was granted the ability to buy a home and go to school after the fact. If there was a black man that grew up next door to him and got drafted at the same time and went to World War II and came back home, they would have excluded him from having a bunch of the same things that my grandfather was granted. So, and if there's a person out there, I don't know who you are, that thinks your grandparents had no affect on who you are. I mean, maybe you were adopted, maybe there's something, I don't know, but it seems pretty odd to me. I've never met a person that just blinked into existence. You know what I'm saying? Like some kind of relationship with your family affects what's going on. Now, you might have no family. Okay, but that's still an affect on who you've become, right? If you grow up in foster care and you grow up alone, you're born into an orphanage and you live in an orphanage and then you go into foster care and all that kind of stuff, like that affects your life. And I'm not trying to exclude those people from this conversation, which is why I'm including them. But I believe that we're all affected by the people, the predecessors that come before us, and not only in our genetic material, but in our material ability to exist in the United States. And it would be impossibly difficult for me to argue any of that kind of stuff for another country because I'm not as attached realistically. If you try to tell me certain Russian history and stuff like that, I'm not able to bring as much to the table because I would much rather fix my own backyard as opposed to to try and fix somebody else's backyard. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah, Dennis says the racist drug laws in the 80s. Yes, 100%. And there still certainly are. There still certainly are a ton of those. Way too many. And that's where, the Black Lives Matter movement, the defund the police, the kind of stuff that's going on is the inequity that still exists within the legal system within the United States. That is the shift from these legal segregation, federally funded segregation in the housing, shifted to policing. And I mentioned that earlier, where there's no reason other than that would give us 2 million people in prison at this point. And you just compare our numbers to the rest of the country or the rest of the planet with how many people we got in prison is just, it's absurdly, it's an absurd number in comparison. Ginger Graves says, for me, it depends on my work schedule. I'm on vacation this week. Sometimes I'm working. My tech uses Twitch for extra money. She games in minute clothing and men or women give her money. Yeah, some people on Twitch wear skimpy outfits. Some people on YouTube wear skimpy outfits. So, yes. But Twitch also has the just chatting feature and stuff like that. It's a lot more interactive for something like this. It's much more difficult to include other people into the direct conversational side of things. Like I can bring in Skype and that kind of stuff onto Twitch. It's much more readily available than it is for YouTube. Really, it's more designed that way. All right. Well, we're getting to that point where I have been flapping my gums for a really long time. But yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to roll through the chat here and see what we got. Indigo says, I follow you here. I'm old school. Yeah, I appreciate everybody following here. And you know what? Maybe the overall response will be like, hey, just do YouTube and we'll figure it out. I mean, that's just, it's a thought that I have. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see what happens. I'm not trying to argue one way or the other, about what's going on. Daniel Velez says, being a Hispanic child born from the Bronx, I saw how many people are held back and are not able to succeed through no fault of their own. I mean, that's the reality, is that if you're exposed to anecdotal evidence, it is fairly easy to go, what the hell? That's weird. I know Steve. Steve's fine. Why isn't Steve doing good? And yes, I'm not trying to downplay anybody's life experiences. That's really what I'm trying to convey with that, is that we all have anecdotal experience that stuff happens. And we all run into that from time to time, for sure. But if we're using only that as our entire decision-making process, it would be incredibly difficult to find somebody that's doing that is making worldly decisions. Is that kind of the way? Is having a real worldly view of other people's experiences, right? That's the thing that kind of upsets me. That's the thing that kind of makes me worried, is that, like, if we're not necessarily learning about other people's experiences or what is possibly going on around us, but not directly here, to have a better understanding of other people, then I think that really hamstrings us a bit. It's like, or more than a bit. I think it really hamstrings humans to just like, well, I don't know, man, sky's blue. It's like, well, what happens when it's raining? I don't know. Sometimes the sky's blue, sometimes it's white. I don't know. The planet's flat Earth. I don't know. And you just kind of like, wait, what? It's like, well, I looked out the window, it's flat. Oh, okay. Well, it's not, you know. So I think it's a matter of learning, you know, and I think it's incredibly important, and you know, we're obviously in a very difficult time right now in 2020. We have a pandemic. You know, we have a lot of people protesting to get some equality within our rights and within our governance and things like that, and blah 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 blah. I mean, the list goes on. You know, I don't want to be considered exclusionary, but we just have to move on and say we're going through a hard time. We've got a lot of things going on, and if we can take the time to, I did look up the audio version of this is only 9 hours long. So that's like, I mean, if you listen to it at work while you're working, I mean, you probably have to listen to it a couple of times while you're working because you're going to be distracted, but really get, you know, 9 hours is not a lot of commitment of just listening to something. I mean, I've been here talking for 90 minutes, so you'd have been well along your way. Look how red my nose is. Bashed my nose yesterday while wearing my mask, and I think my nose is all red. Right at the end. Hey, red nose guy, what's going on? All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming out today. Feel free to comment. Let me know what's going on. Hit me up on Discord, whatever. I appreciate everybody coming out. No super chats hanging or anything weird like that. Kylan Landry. Oh my God, I forgot to say anything to you. If you're still here, Kylan, says, I love how you're using your channel. Little Miss Olivia is lucky to have you as a dad. Well, that is very kind. Also, this is what people who have reach need to be doing. This is what they need to teach in school. This is why this country is the way it is. Yeah, and I agree with that. Kylan, if you're still here, I'm sorry I didn't respond to your comments earlier. That is a little lame. Juan Davila says, great video. Thank you. All right, cool. Okay, well, I hope everybody has a continued fun weekend. Tomorrow, trimming your bush is the video for tomorrow. So keeping it light for a Sunday. Talking about some bush trimming. Aquarium stuff is back tomorrow morning, and you'll be able to watch that. And I don't know. It's not that in-depth of a video or nothing. It's just